Thank you, Vanessa. So yes, we are recording tonight's Science Pub so that we can share it again after this event, but we're really excited to have such a large group with us here online, but as well as at the UAF Pub in Fairbanks, where Zav is stationed, manning multiple forms of technology, so be impressed. And yeah, anyways, once again, my name is Courtney Breest with Alaska EPSCoR, Fire and Ice, and that grant is studying wildfires in the boreal forests in Alaska, as well as in 2 locations, we are researching glaciated streams and their nearshore environments. And that's a multidisciplinary NSF research grant. And we're in the middle of it. And we're thrilled to be co-hosting this event with Telesomm. And I will hand it over to Vanessa to share more about that.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad that you took time to hang out with us tonight and that you get to hear from Zav and Jett. I think this is going to be a really fun science pub. And when I heard that EPSCoR was thinking about science pubs, but not sure how to pull it off in the pandemic and hybrid world, I was like, well, I think we could maybe collaborate on this. So I am the founder of Telesomm. Telesomm is an app where you can purchase wine experiences such as wine tastings and menu planning with people like Jett. We have 13 wine professionals all across the United States. And I am typically based in Fairbanks, the land of the Lower Tanana Dene. However, right now I'm in Cape Cod, which is the land of the Wampanoag tribe. I'm going to ask everyone on the call to mute just so that we have a clean recording for people later. And I'm going to pass this off to Jett to introduce themselves, and then we'll hear from Zav.
All right. Hey, everyone. I'm in Atlanta, part of Telesomm. I have background in wine and help manage a shop in Atlanta, all female owned, operated, run. So we're kind of a fun little hip shop. And yeah, Kaitlin, Jett, Kolarik, that's me. And yeah, I'm just excited to talk about some wine and fire stuff.
Awesome. Thank you, Jett. Zav, how's it feeling at the pub? Are you ready to kick us off and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sounds good. It's getting busier here. It's getting a bit loud, so I hope you guys can hear me over the other people talking. How's it sound?
It sounds great.
Okay.
All right, we see a notice that you're sharing screen, and your screen is up, Zav.
You ready to go? Check.
Yeah,
Check.
we're ready. And you sound great on our end.
Okay, I don't know if I have in-building audio yet, so just one second.
Thank you all for hanging out during our first hybrid in-person virtual event at the popular campus pub, no less.
Yeah, I was just going to say we have Michael DeLue, who is on Lower Tanana Dene land, and he's Team Wildfire for about 25 more minutes. So the clock is ticking. Going to switch over to Team Wine.
I think that is cleverly matching up with 5 p.m. Alaska time, so I approve. I've also got my my switch out here, ready to transition. Yes.
All right. Does it still sound okay with the mic on in the room?
It's a little boomy. How are people feeling?
A little bit of feedback.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm gonna just turn it off then. I'm just gonna try to talk as loud as possible for the room.
That's working well.
Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction. I'm Zav Grabinski. I work with the Alaska Fire Science Consortium. Today, I'll be talking about trends in Alaskan wildfire in the context of a changing environment, as well as presenting on the drivers of fire size and severity. All right, just let me know if there's too much feedback. Sorry, it's a little tricky here.
Okay, thanks, Zav.
Okay. So area burned by wildfire varies tremendously from year to year. Although there is variability, we're seeing wildfire burning more acres and expanding into new areas of the state. The increasing area burned, along with fires that are more frequent, survive over winter, or reburn the same location after just a few years, are consistent with the predicted effects of climate change. So in this graph, in the red, we can see years that have over 1 million acres burned. And then here in the orange, there are years with less than 1 million acres burned. So there's a lot of variability from year to year, but there's a clear trend of more fires consuming more acres. And this has statewide implications, including increased risk for people, property, and resources. Let's take a quick look at some of the climate factors that may be contributing to more frequent fires. Alaska is getting hotter fast. Summer temperatures across Alaska have been increasing since 1970. A typical summer nowadays is close to what the warmest summers were prior to the 1970s. So in this graph, we can see there's quite a bit of variability across the state. Here in the North Slope, it's actually warmed 6 degrees in the last 50 years. Alaska's wildfire season is getting longer. Over the past 40 years, the first large fire of the season starts earlier and the last large fire of the season starts later. One of the drivers of the increase in fire season length is snowpack. This graphic is nearly the inverse of the previous graphic of fire season length. Alaska snowpack now develops about a week later in autumn and melts nearly 2 weeks earlier in spring compared to the late 1990s. In this graph, we can see that humans cause more fires in Alaska than lightning. Early season fire is often the result of human-caused wildfire ignitions when outdoor recreation activities and debris burning lead to unintentional fire starts. These fires are usually close to communities and receive aggressive suppression response, so typically they don't get very large. Although the number of human and lightning ignitions are comparable, lightning ignitions burn far more acres than human-caused fires each year. Lightning-ignited fires are often in areas of limited suppression and more difficult to reach locations. These fires are in places where managers can allow them to burn freely, where they serve their ecological role without directly impacting human life or property. Fires occur predominantly between the Alaska and Brooks mountain range, where warm summers, low precipitation, frequent lighting, and black spruce dominated ecosystems contribute to frequent and large fire. However, we are seeing trends of fire moving outside of this zone and into the tundra and coastal regions more frequently. Keep this green shape in mind for comparison to the next map. This is a map of fire perimeters from 1960 to 2020. Notice almost all of the fires are between the Alaska and Brooks mountain ranges in this intermontane boreal fire zone. However, fire is expanding more into the northern areas and western areas of the state. For example, the Anatuvik River fire of 2007. This fire doubled the total area burned at Alaska's North Slope since 1960s and consumed more than 250,000 acres. Notably, this fire was most active in September. Increased fire activity in the far north is of special interest because of carbon stored in permafrost. Frozen permafrost holds an estimated 1,400 gigatons of carbon, This amount of carbon is greater than what is already in the atmosphere today. Wildfires release the stored carbon to the atmosphere by removing the duff and soil layers that insulate permafrost, accelerating its thaw. Thawed permafrost can cause surface waters to drain, resulting in drier and more flammable duff. As permafrost thaws, it releases more methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, setting up an amplifying feedback to climate warming. Let's take a look at fires in 20-year intervals. In this map, we can see wildfire perimeters from 1961 to 1980. Note they're mostly in the interior region of the state. Over the next 20 years, we see about 10% more wildfire, with wildfire covering more of the landscape. And now let's look at the most recent 20 years. Here we have over 31 million acres burned in 20 years. This is more than 2.5 times the previous amount of fire in the previous 20 decades. Note, fires moving far to the north and to western Alaska. Most of the figures from this presentation came from a recent outreach publication, Alaska's Changing Wildfire Environment. If you're interested, you can pick up a copy in person here from Allison York. She can also give you a copy of a new publication in Scientific American. They're both good reads. And so I'd like to just take a second to introduce the organization I work for. I'm part of the Alaska Fire Science Consortium. We work with fire managers and researchers to facilitate understanding of research needs and the latest tools in fire science. We're a small organization housed at UAF's International Arctic Research Center, and we are one of 15 regional consortia that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. We've talked about how more extreme weather has led to an increase in wild size and frequency. Now let's talk about how compounding extreme weather effects can potentially lead to more severe fires on the landscape. In this panel, we see a typical interior Alaskan boreal forest: spruce trees, understory willow, grasses, moss, a decomposing duff layer, mineral soil with an ice wedge, discontinuous permafrost. Let's think about the landscape and extreme weather events that occur simultaneously. So, for example, what's going to happen when there's high temperatures followed by drought, and then when we add wind into the mix? Let's think about this landscape, and then let's think what's going to happen when fire comes across it. So here in the next slide, fire has covered the landscape, and we can see an increased effect of fire on the landscape compounded by the weather conditions as they add to one another. For example, in this far right column, scenarios with drought, heat, and wind, when they're all combined, they can easily lead to severe fire, where their entire landscape is scorched, including down to the mineral soil, where the permafrost becomes exposed. I'd like to briefly talk about smoke before I conclude my section. Smoke is by far the most far-reaching impact of wildfire. In fact, this summer, there are hazy skies in Anchorage for massive wildfires in Siberia. In this graphic, we can see that there's been a lot more smoky days in interior Alaska. This graph measures smoke visibility of less than 6 miles. Since 2014, we can see that there have been many more smoky days in Fairbanks since in the last 2 decades. Wildfire smoke impacts are diverse and even affect the flavor of wine. With that, I'll turn it over and we can learn more about it. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Zav, and major kudos to you for presenting in a hybrid environment. You are the real MVP right now. Jett, are you ready to jump in?
I'm ready.
All right. Does everyone have a glass to raise before we?
I was about to say. And digital cheers, I guess.
Yeah, somebody get Zav a beverage. Oh, I see the pub. Thank
Oh,
you.
cool.
Oh, hi everyone.
All right. Well, cool. Well, thank you for that throwback or toss over. That was awesome. Good transition. So my focus is going to be a little bit more on wine in the West Coast. There's wine produced in Alaska, but it's mostly fruit wine. And so most of what I am going to focus on will be that. And we'll start with my way less fancy one, but I'm going to be focusing more on resiliency in winemaking, because the wine industry has certainly been through a lot over its long existence. So the wildfires of 2020 were really, really incredibly devastating for many wineries along the Pacific Northwest. Sonoma and Napa were hit really, really hard, but they have been hit by fires like starting in 2017. And like Zav said, grapes are really affected by smoke. So if we look at how the wine industry is reacting to all of this, they have a lot of like different agricultural and economic resilience. So in looking at how, there we go, resiliency factors into this, I really loved this quote. Judd Wallenbrock. Brock is the CEO of Mondavi, which you might be familiar with. They do Krog. But when you work in agriculture, you learn to be resilient. And I love the quote, the earth is resilient and so are we. And if you think back, the wine industry has been through prohibition here. So 13 years in the US, we couldn't sell alcohol. Phylloxera devastated things, the end of the 1800s, 1860s. So the wine industry is poised to, like, they have a good bit of money. So if we're looking at like how the vineyards react, it definitely, they have money to experiment. So wineries will be able to come out of this almost better than before. So in looking at how grapes are affected, so we'll start with that. The smoke is not the only thing, or the fire is not the only thing that devastates the wine industry. Smoke creates this chemical issue called smoke taint, which is really what affects the grapes most. So it mostly is affected by fires closer up, but the sort of ambient smoke can definitely affect them. And it kind of creates this taste or smell like an ashtray, which is not always fun. Some people like their wine a bit smoky, but it's not always the best. So going into how wineries are protecting against this issue of wildfires, there's a lot of different things they can do, because wine isn't just about this cool beverage that we all like. It's also protecting culture, history. Wine is a big part of a lot of people's lives. So if we're looking at how they prevent it, there are a lot of different ways to prevent destruction in the vineyard. They can keep the vegetation low. If they irrigate, that will help keep things a little damper. They might have cover crops, but there's, let's see. Yeah. So when it goes to wine production, grapes, you don't really know until a couple years in how it's really going to affect the wine. But a lot of people have been pivoting. So right before this, I actually got an email. So I am drinking Dollar Bills Only by Patricia Green Cellars. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with that winery in Oregon, but they are incredible. And they made this wine as a result of the destruction of the fires. They actually had to declassify the wine. And his email said that he essentially took over 8,000 gallons of Pinot Noir, and instead of making wine, they distilled it into brandy. And so they made, as he says, this really incredible whiskey. And Brienne Day is another one that did that. They get distillers, they make brandy, because we're still learning a lot about how smoke and fire affects grapes chemically. There are some people experimenting with different kinds of chemicals to prevent smoke taint, but this is still a very big learning experience. So a lot of people are if they do have enough grapes, they'll press them really quickly. A lot of people are making rosé, which goes to my next point of Brienne Day is one of my favorite winemakers. She's in Oregon, and they were really, really affected by the fires. So she created lemonade, which is let's all just make the best of this. She actually was out in the vineyards. A lot of concern is for the workers in the vineyards because of the conditions of smoke. So she was actually out there picking grapes herself. A lot of winemakers had to lay off their entire staff to keep them safe. If their vineyards weren't completely burned down, maybe they're like some people's houses were. Looking at Division Winery, this is one of my favorites. A lot of these in Oregon. We will get to some Californias, but this is their Hestia. So this was a blend that they did. Hestia is the goddess of the hearth. So this is actually art on the label by a Minneapolis-based artist. And this is to depict the eerie sky before harvest in 2020. And harvest for wine happens at the end of summer. So like August, September, October going into that. So they're trying to figure out why grapes are affected more than other fruits and vegetables. And it could be when they pick them. But I just think they're incredible. Everything will be okay on the door. You can see there. A lot of people are experimenting with using different varietals, maybe more sturdy varietals. A lot of wineries in different regions are getting a little more attention. So like Maryland, New York State, places are a little cooler. So we're seeing a lot of pivoting, a lot of trying different things. And like he was saying, Jim Anderson from Patricia Green Cellar, there's financial things that are going to stack up for them later on. We won't see it until a lot of wine is aged. But he said it's been a stressful time. It's required a lot of dealing with a range of, excuse my language, shit emotions, which I feel like is, yeah, putting it lightly. But a lot of them will pay their growers. There's just a lot of financial issues that are going to come up later. I think some people in doing the brandy are able to make a good profit with lemonade. She actually released this in November, which is pretty crazy, and sold all of it. So that was like a really great buffer for them in struggling with financial issues. The sensory issue that you get with smoke taint affected grapes. This is my model dog Shiloh, showing how you smell wine, and my amazing boss Sarah, kind of giving a good example of that. But in the glass, you'll have smokiness. You're going to have a lot of differences. We actually have one wine, Love Drunk. This is Maison Noir. Andre Mack is one of our favorite winemakers. And the Love Drunk wine was actually really affected. We didn't know it until we tried a bottle and we realized it tasted like mezcal. And we'd had some regulars who really loved it. So it might just be a taste thing for some people, but we actually had to send some back. So yeah, and then we've got in California, this is another winery if you want to support them, Good Luck Bunchu. They have been around for like 150 years. Their main house burned down. So just a lot of issues going through that. And here's just some more. Mayacamas was affected. Frey was affected. They're one of the first biodynamic organic vineyards in the States. So yeah, just a lot of pivoting, but like the quote said, the earth is resilient and so are we. So I think we're going to see a lot of difference in the 2020 vintages of wine, but fortunately 2019 was amazing, and don't discredit 2020 vintages. They're going to be amazing for what people could do. Because like I said before, the wine industry has been through a lot, and it's an industry that people fight really hard for. We want to continue being sustainable. We want to continue making wine for a long time and being good to the earth. So I think the wine industry is poised to do a lot of good as far as figuring all this out and changing things. So that is all I have on, let me see, stop share. Yeah, on my end of things, there's obviously loads more I could say on wine, but if anybody has questions, we could talk about it later. But oh yeah, the thing.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jett. That was fantastic. Now we have a background in Wildfire as well as wine, a little bit of foundation to get us started on a discussion between Zav and Jett. and I'm going to share a graphic to help with that. And I just want to encourage everyone to continue posting questions into the chat, and then we'll get some from the pub as well after this discussion over a few different topics that cross both wine and wildfire. Okay, are you guys both seeing that, Zav and Jett?
Okay, great. I'm gonna be having to mute and unmute the room and myself, so it might be a little tricky, but I'll do my best. So the fire season in Alaska can be described by 4 different seasons, particularly in the interior region of the state. Fire season begins in April, typically before full green up, when the below ground soil is still frozen. At this point, the most readily available fuels are dead grasses and surface litter. With these limited fuels, wind is the key driver of fire activity. Fire can spread and grow rapidly, but usually with low severity because it cannot burn deeply into the moist and frozen duff. So this was a little bit about how wind affects fire and the windy season in Alaska. And then we're going to move on to soil, temperature, and drought. But I'll let Jett talk a little bit about wind.
Well, wind has always affected wine quite a bit. It helps to, like in non-fire days, it helps to keep the grapes dry, prevent from mold rot. So when you're talking about wind in this context and it's blowing smoke all over the place, really essentially wineries, if they're next to each other, anything from one winery to another is going to affect them if they use pesticides. Wind will let pesticides into the vineyard. So it's similar with wind. A lot of wineries who are on higher slopes really benefit. There have been a few wineries I've chatted with recently that are on tops of mountains and they've been completely untouched by smoke. But I do know that the closer to the fire and the smoke, you'll get a lot more issues with the grapes and vineyards. Yeah, there's a lot of things that they're doing to prevent against that. But yeah, wind is huge in the wine world anyway. So yeah, I don't know where to stop, but there's a lot more to it. Yeah. So that's how it affects wine in a fire context.
Okay, great. Yeah, let's talk about soils for a moment. So I've mentioned this word duff a lot, and duff is a key differentiating characteristic of fire in boreal forests. Just below the ground surface, there are slowly decomposing organic materials mixed with soils that can become very dry and spread fire across long distances. Fire activity greatly increases in June as long sunny days quickly dry out these duff fuels. Fires occurring during this period are characterized by sudden growth events related to hot, dry, sunny days and can produce high flammability despite green vegetation. These peak season fires can quickly become uncontrollable. And this is due to this underground subsurface fuel that we call duff.
And we had a related question to this in the chat from Allie. Allie wrote, I noticed in some of the photos there is cheatgrass, and Zav, you may know more about that. I do not. In the vineyards, are any vineyards working to reduce invasive species to reduce fire frequency and temperature? So I think either of you, if you have any thoughts on that question related to duff and soils and what's the fuel in the June, July time period.
I'll go ahead and quick on that. With wine, soil is kind of everything. So we talk a lot about the different soil in different regions and how it affects wine, grapes, the vines, flavor profile, everything. So a lot of wineries I've spoken to recently that had more gravelly soil and less sort of duff or, it's not a term I'm used to using a lot, so I might have gotten that wrong. But, if they have a lot of like debris or then it'll be a little more fuel for fire. But if they have like sandier soils, that's why places in like Spain and other places survived phylloxera because it's a little bug and they didn't like the sand. So in the same context, more gravelly stone soil definitely helps prevent the fire from getting closer. A lot of wineries also employ cover crops or use animals to keep vegetation really low. A lot of people utilize animals in different ways in vineyards. So in this instance, sheep are really popular to keep vegetation really low. I haven't heard the term, it's not really something you hear too much as far as invasive species. They're really controlled with what they allow in the vineyard. So there's not usually too many invasive species to begin with, because everything, any kind of plant nearby a winery affects the, pardon me, smell and taste and everything of wine. So that's kind of how it affects wineries.
Okay, great. Should we move on to temperature and drought then? So in Alaska, as we move into July, if temperatures remain high and precipitation is low, drought may extend and expand the fire seasons we have seen in recent years. So temperature is definitely getting hotter in Alaska. Precipitation is more variable, but research has shown that precipitation is increasing a little bit. However, other research indicates that precipitation would have to increase by about 7 to 10% in intensity per degree of temperature to offset fuel drying. That means if it's 6 degrees warmer, it would have to be about 60% wetter, which is just not the case. So we're seeing more drought, higher temperatures, and also with this increase in precipitation, we're also getting more lightning, and lightning is the main driver of acreage of fires burned. So it's been quite the increase in the last decade of drought-driven fire.
Yeah, that's an incredible stat, Zav, and I love these things you're pulling out for us. We have a question related to the heat of fires and the temperature of fires. So I'll pose that to you both. It's from Ali Pedersen from a little bit earlier in the evening. Would you say the average temperatures of the fires have changed or not?
Great question. There's not a great answer to it, unfortunately. It's difficult to measure the temperature of a fire. Fires characterized in a few different ways. There's fire intensity, which is kind of what the question is getting at, and that's a measure of heat or how many calories of fire produces, essentially, or joules. Fire severity is a more often used metric, and that measures the impact on the landscape, as one of my slides was getting at earlier. And so that can be somewhat used as a proxy for fire intensity, but not entirely. Unfortunately, it's difficult to measure fire severity in Alaska. A lot of the good metrics of fire severity are through satellite detections. Since fire severity is so determined by underground effects in Alaska, satellites don't do a great job of picking it up yet. But in the Western United States, we have seen an increase in fire severity. So presumably that may mean fires are burning hotter.
And Jett, I know that there was a lot of hot fires in 2020, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
With like lightning being generated.
Yeah, I mean, 2020 was arguably one of the worst years for the wine world, despite how, like I said, they've been through a lot. The fires are kind of unprecedented, and people are still kind of reeling from them and figuring out what to do. There's a lot of people, again, pivoting, a lot of research being done. Also, I wanted to quickly address Phylloxera is not really a concern anymore. It's that little louse that it affected the wine world in the late 1800s, 1860s, but it like devastated everything, like just knocked everything out. Yeah, kind of off topic, but yeah, the fires were really terrible, and have definitely getting worse, and it's something that we are all very aware of moving forward, are going to be just something to be used to now, and to continue to try and figure out how to navigate that. I mean, with temperatures rising from everything else, that's affecting the wine world. It's affecting, the region of Champagne. We're not going to have those same kind of bubbles for a while, having to use different grapes in different regions that are going to be more suited to different climates as the temperature rises. But we're kind of losing those really nice cool climate areas. So yeah.
I mean, maybe we'll be talking about Alaskan wine growing regions someday. Okay, so thank you for that. We have a few more questions in the chat and some love for the graphs. Zav, you're getting a lot of applause in the chat. There's a question about wind. Do you guys want to hold it until later and get through the seasons?
Was that the
wind is huge in the wine world.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And does it reference fire, smoke, or just something else?
Everything. So when you're talking about wine, you're talking about terroir, and it's everything. It's water, it's soil, it's air, it's the nearby plants. So when talking about wind, if you look at a grape called, you all know Pinot Noir. When looking at Pinot Noir, it's a very thin-skinned grape. It was also really affected by the fires this year because it is so thin-skinned. But it also clusters really closely. It kind of looks like a pine cone. And so without conditions and wind, it really does well in cooler climates with a lot of wind, because if it didn't have wind, it would have a lot of issues with different kinds of rot and all the various fun things that come with grapes being too close together and not aerated enough. But I mean, the wind, everything affects it. Diurnal climate, different breezes that come off of, Van Duzer, there's just so much that wind affects wine, and it's so important. A lot of time it'll come over, wind will cool off the grapes, and that's really great for keeping balance and acid in wine. So wind is most often a friend to wine, but with the fires, it's definitely been a challenge. It also tends to blow pesticides or herbicides from other wineries into other ones. So that's something that people have to be really aware of as well with wind.
So we just had a couple more topics we wanted to tackle in the discussion. Yeah, so I don't know if Jett or Zav, would one of you like to, I don't know, touch on drought or move on to slope if you have a preference?
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak on slope for a minute. So slope is the steepness of the land. Steeper slopes can cause fire to move more quickly upslope as a result of hot air rising and drying fuel sources up the hill from the fire. Conversely, fires might move down steeper slopes more slowly than a gradual slope. Slope is a very important driver of fire. Another important landscape feature that affects fire is aspect. And aspect is the direction that the land faces. South-facing slopes are warmer and get more sunlight, while north-facing slopes are cooler and receive less. Certain slope directions allow for growth of vegetation that can favor or suppress fire. And also, terrain can create natural barriers that act as natural fire breaks. Some examples of this include lowlands, areas along bodies of water that have a high amount of moisture, or rocky areas that don't contain fuel and allow fire to grow. So slope and features of the physical landscape have a lot of different implications for fire and fire severity.
I guess the tie-in with wine would be a lot of winemakers will plant on slopes because certain facing slopes get an excellent amount of sun, which they want, like south facing, there's different perks to different areas. So if you are planting your vines on a slope and this is an issue, then you're probably going to lose those during a fire, but ideally not. But that's only tie-in I can think of with slope for wine is just you have a lot of vineyards throughout the world that have very steep vineyards planted where you have to there's certain places you have to helicopter grapes down, or they use donkeys, so that's kind of how slope relates to the wine world.
Great, thanks. I had one question, just selfishly to chime in. There was also talk of irrigation in regards to the slope. I was wondering if you had anything to talk about in terms of that. I think that's more for Jett.
So the question was about irrigation on slopes?
Yeah, and like is that an important part of the winemaking process?
Yeah, definitely. Irrigation is different for a lot of people. I think people have probably heard of like dry farm wines. There's a lot of like kind of gimmicky things out there that do actually relate back to real things in the wine world. Some people will choose not to irrigate, and that's kind of where the dry farm comes from. They just let the vines work really hard to get really deep into the ground to find water. But some people have been irrigating more. One thing that kind of helps with fires is to actually irrigate the area and then kind of keep humidity up in the vineyards kind of helps. So for places that do irrigate, that is a benefit. This cat is crazy. So it's just different for wherever people are and how they want to do wine. So, I mean, if you really, really want natural biodynamic wine, you don't really use a lot of traditional irrigation or pesticide, any kind of methods like that. So when it comes to drought irrigation, it's kind of different for everybody. Anybody want a cat? I've got one for sale.
And Jett, can you just define dry farming for wine for everyone?
Yeah, so that's when they don't actually irrigate. There's no like sprinklers or anything. It's actually when they just let the vines. So one thing with wine is the more stressed the vines, the more complex the wine is going to be. So, okay. So dry farm wine is basically just letting the letting the vines work really hard. They have to go really deep to find water, or they'll just like slightly irrigate. But yeah, dry farming, the more stressed vines, the tastier the wine, oddly enough. So, which is probably why we'll see some great wines from the 2020 vintage, because those were some stressed vines. So that's kind of a little bit about dry farming, but I think people are using it in a gimmicky term now, kind of like the low sugar, low calorie, fit wines, things like that. So dry farming is actually just letting the vines work a little harder.
Thank you for that.
So last up, we have smoke, which you both touched on a little bit, but love to have you guys compare and contrast a little bit with one another, and then we'll take more questions. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. All Alaskans can remember some of the smokiest years. We had 2004 followed by 2005. And as a teenager who just played soccer, that was a terrible summer. The smoke was so thick that we didn't have internet. Yeah, it's a hard time. Yeah, smoke is particularly hazardous because it's very fine. Particulate matter 2.5 mm or smaller can enter into the lungs and bloodstream and cause serious problems. Smoke also kind of disproportionately affects different areas. For example, there's a lot of communities and villages that are only accessible by boat or by plane, and as we know, with low visibility, you can't fly. So communities can be totally cut off from supplies during really smoky summers.
Man, that's crazy. So as for wine, they're still kind of learning about the effects of smoke on grapes. There are a lot of studies happening. But like I said before, it's still as far as how it affects grapes, we're kind of in a big learning curve right now. They know that smoke is affecting grapes more than other, vegetation, fruit. And that could be because like the thickness of the skin on grapes is a little more important. It could be they pick the fruits and vegetables a little earlier in the season, so they kind of prevent too much smoke. But really, smoke creates this chemical that gets in all the phenols, all that kind of good stuff. But essentially, like, it gets into the sugars, and sugars are how you make alcohol. So you might not even be able to taste it on the grape beforehand, or notice it on a grape until you actually go through the fermentation process. And that's kind of where you figure out how affected it is. That's why a lot of people are doing rosé, like the lemonade wine I was talking about. It's actually just Pinot Noir, it's rosé. If you press the grapes, press the juice really quickly, they don't have a lot of contact with the skin, then you have just this really nice light rosé that has been really helpful, I think, for some people financially to do rosé. But yeah, for the wines that actually have to age, I think we're not going to figure out how it's going to taste or be affected for a while. Some people think that maybe over time it'll kind of go away. We're not sure. But smoke is definitely one of the biggest influences. Obviously, vines being affected by fire, but smoke is kind of more pervasive, I think. So.
Thank you. Well, that covers our scheduled programming, and we'd love to take more questions from the audience at the pub, as well as all of you on chat. I think I can kick one off that I saw from earlier in the chat. This is mostly for Jett in terms of wine. It says, excuse me, I'm sorry, I lost the name. It was further back, but the question is the wine industry embracing regenerative agriculture, or is it still a small group of wineries?
That is a very good question. That's not something I've heard a lot about as far as regenerative culture. Oh, I gotta talk regenerative culture. But again, it's like everybody is kind of doing something different. More natural wineries are experimenting in different ways. That is something I would probably have to research more, but I've never heard anyone mention it, which is interesting now that the question has been posed. So yeah, it's something I would have to look into. So I wish I had more on it, but it's just not something I've heard anything about with all the different kind of things folks are doing.
Yeah, thank you, Jett, and thank you for that question.
Looks like
we have
the first question.
Oh, from the pub.
I'll type it in the chat.
I'm just wondering why are more stressed vines?
I heard, why are more stressed vines create more complex wine?
Audience member.
Yeah. So imagine if you have a big field of Pinot Noir grapes, easy one to go to. They get plenty of sun, they get plenty of water. There's just so many Pinot Noir grapes out there. There's not going to be a lot of flavor, really. It's going to be sort of watered down because there's just so many of them. So there's not a lot of focus on the grapes. But if vines are put through more, if they don't grow as many, if it's more concentrated, then you get a lot more flavor to the wine. There's in Spain, in Priorat, the vines actually grow through this decomposing slate called Icaria. And some of the wine in Priorat is some of like the boldest, spiciest, like most fun wine. And it's because those vines have to literally like work through this slate. It's kind of like very chalky slate. And because it has to work so hard, it doesn't produce a lot of grapes. So the grapes it does produce are just very, very complex and super tasty. So a lot of people will actually prune back if they have a lot of grapes on a vine, or, like the dry farming, they'll kind of let them stress. But, for grapes in different like cooler climates and kind of harder areas, the wine tends to be a bit more, they have to work harder for it, but it's definitely the end result is really cool. So I hope that kind of answers that question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jett. And then Zav, we have a question for you in the chat. Were you able to read that one?
Yeah, could I address a local question first? Go ahead.
Yes, please.
Not fire damage. In other words, fire itself, but we didn't lose a lot of things.
Put the question in the chat. So asking for clarification, are we talking about smoke damage to the grape, not fire damage itself, or have significant amount of acreage of vineyards actually been lost?
Yes, definitely. If you look at how many in the email that I got back from Patricia Green Sellers, this kind of illustrates it really well. In 2019, they made 13,500 cases of their Pinot Noir. This year, they made 830 cases. So definitely a lot of vineyards have been burned completely. The wineries I've talked about today have not been entirely destroyed as far as vineyards go. A lot of their buildings have been, but yeah, the demolition and the destruction to actual vineyards has been really, really awful. But again, they'll find a way to come back, hopefully. But yeah, smoke damage is more relatable to the wine that is actually able to be produced. But is in terms of actual grapes, the numbers are really low this year, last year.
Great, and it looks like there's a couple of questions in the chat about prescribed burning, one from Randy and then another follow-up question, so I'll read those out. From Randy, one thought that occurs to me, if we could do more low intensity prescribed fire in wine country, often during shoulder seasons or spring or fall, to lessen the chance of severe wildfires, maybe the grapes would be less impacted since the fruit isn't on it. And yeah, that's a great thought. Prescribed fire definitely has a lot of use, and I don't really know too much about what's causing the biggest amount of smoke. I assume more severe fires, larger fires, is going to be more smoke. So if the areas around the vineyards are buffered by prescribed fire, that could mean less smoke, less damage in the area. There's a follow-up kind of thought on that from Polly Pedersen, and that's I would think that prescribed burns would damage the local seed banks in the soil, further reducing local fire-resistant plants. So that's her question, and it's hard to say for certain on that, but typically prescribed burns are during the shoulder seasons, spring and fall, and generally they're in low fuel loads or in grass type areas, which typically is low severity fire, which in general doesn't damage the seed bank too bad, depending on the ecology of the plant. So thanks for those questions.
Yeah, and thank you, Zav, for answering them both. Jett, I was wondering if you had heard about prescribed burns or any sort of fire management by wineries or wine regions, really, because it would be kind of outside the winery probably.
That's not something I've heard a lot about. It does make a lot of sense. But I think in looking forward in wine production, it is something that they'll probably need to think about. I think a lot of the things they're focusing on right now is sort of more about how to prevent it in their own area, but it's becoming so prevalent that it's something that they'll definitely need to consider. I'm not sure if they would have the resources to do that. I'm sure they would. I mean, it takes about $500,000 to start a winery in Napa, so ideally they have some funds going in. I did find my numbers too about how much the Grape Crush report went down this year. They saw the vintage down was like 13.8% from 2019, and then the overall volume in North Coast went down by 30%, and that is a 43% reduction in Napa Cab, and then a 39% drop in Sonoma Pinot Noir. So those are just some examples of how much we've lost as far as grapes go.
Wow, that's impressive. So we're coming up on 9:30.
Local question here. The question is there any new research on the relationship of mycorrhizal fungi and the health of grapevines, or grapes specifically, on how fire may be impacting the relationship between the species? And wow, what an interesting question. That would be a great topic for a dissertation, like something I know a little bit about all of the pieces, but have no idea how they fit together. But yeah, without a doubt, the wildfire will be affecting the mycorrhizal fungi, but I don't know about the grape part of it.
And for the lay folk, can you define mycorrhizal fungi?
Yeah, probably not that well, but they're the fungi that associate with tree tips in the soil, in the roots, and they decompose and are important microbes in anything that grows or interacts with the soil.
Funnel a lot of nutrients from
they funnel a lot of nutrients directly from the soil into the plants around them.
Gonna have to look that one up.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to ask my reps about that, and my wine folks in the future.
So I wanted to say we're coming up on the hour. I think Zav and Jett have done an incredible job, but special kudos to Zav for working 2 computers and chat and in person. Although Jett, the cat, is taking you for your paces.
Yeah, she's a lot.
I think people do want to meet the cat for sure. I also realized, Zav, we never got an intro from you, and I want to make sure that everyone knows about you and who you're repping. And then
I'd be happy to. Yeah, I'm Zav Grabinski. I work with the Alaska Fire Science Consortium. I'm the communication specialist, and Randy Jan's been in the chat. She's the fire ecologist, and Allison York is here in person, and she has some copies of the materials I've been going over in case anyone wants them. They can also email me them, and I'd be happy to mail them for free. And yeah, really appreciate the opportunity. It's been a fun session for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. So I don't know if people have any parting thoughts. I'm down to hang out and chat and sip seltzer water. I don't have any good wine in the house.
I come back to Atlanta. Yeah. If anyone has any other questions about wine, I've got a minute or not. We're gonna talk about the cat. I don't know.
Yeah. It looks like Patrick, do you have a question, or are you waving goodbye? Feel free to speak up if you want.
I think people are.
That might just be a goodbye.
Yep. Yeah. I'm going to put some Telesomm links in the chat for people if you want to follow up with us. And maybe Jett and Zav and Courtney, if you have links that you want people to know about. It's been incredible hanging out with you guys tonight.
Yeah,
this has been fantastic.
Like I've learned a lot. I'm excited to take that into more wine experiences, and I have to figure out that fungi. That's exciting.
Yeah. And please feel free to get in touch with us. If you're online and you would like some of that documentation Zav mentioned, we'll make sure we get you in touch with him. And I'm sure we'll follow up and share more about Jett's bottle shop, which I am dying to visit now. And yeah, I'm a little bit jealous we're not at the pub to continue just chatting about wines and wildfire all night, but this has been amazing.
Yeah, it's a great place to be. That's for sure.
Bye.
Well, we should let you go, Zav, so you can enjoy the room and get your accolades. Yeah, I'll hang out until people go. Jett, that was awesome.
Okay, thanks all.
I'm gonna stop recording.
Okay.
Bye, Zav. Thank you. MVP.
Can we meet your cat formally?